A trembling hand brushed against the rim of the cup, porcelain clinking faintly like a secret about to escape. Her silence had become so familiar it felt like a second skin, stitched tightly over wounds no one had ever truly seen. She smiled politely, nodded where she should, and concealed the raw ache that pulsed behind her ribs. The world believed her strength, but inside, a storm of shame churned, swallowing her words before they could cross her lips. That silence was not peace. It was exile from her own voice. And deep within, a question pressed like a hidden bruise. When did she begin mistaking absence for safety? The body always remembers what the mind denies. The tightening chest, the shallow breath, the way her shoulders folded inward as if to make herself smaller. These gestures were not random. They were echoes of the first betrayal, the unspoken message that her worth was conditional. Jung once said that what remains unconscious rules our lives, and here, silence became her tyrant. The girl she once was still crouched in the dark corners of memory, begging to be heard, yet she kept her hidden because the world had taught her that need was weakness. Do you feel that weight? The one pressing on your chest each time you swallow what you wish you could say. It was not always this way. Once she had been vivid, alive, reckless with laughter. But betrayal does not arrive with thunder. It creeps like shadow, teaching you to distrust your own joy. One broken promise at a time, she learned to dim her flame to avoid rejection. This is how women become split, part of them yearning to roar, part of them chained to silence. That split is the birthplace of shame, where the archetype of the silenced maiden sits across from the shadowed mother who whispers, "Endure." Heavy, isn't it? To realize the voice you buried was never gone, only muffled beneath generations of compliance. The silence had a function. It kept her safe when truth felt like danger, when exposure meant humiliation. Yet what once protected her now strangled her. This is the paradox of the psyche. The shield that saves a child becomes the cage of the adult. If you trace back your own silence, where does it begin? With a father's indifference, with a mother's unspoken sorrow, with a lover's cutting dismissal. The origin does not matter as much as the recognition that this silence is not your essence. It is a scar, not your soul. But the scar still aches. At night, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, memories flickered uninvited. The argument that left her trembling, the look that said she was too much, the betrayal that taught her not to trust her instincts. Jung wrote that the shadow is not evil, it is simply what we refuse to see, and in refusing, we bind ourselves to it. Silence, then, was her unconscious vow, her loyalty to the very wound she longed to escape. Can you see your own vow? The way you cling to the silence as if it keeps you alive, even as it hollows you out. Because silence is never neutral. It dissolves joy, corrodes intimacy, eats away at the tender edges of desire. It whispers that speaking will end in loss, so you hold your tongue again and again until even your own reflection feels foreign. Yet the paradox burns. The very thing you avoid, voice, expression, truth, is the medicine your soul craves. The inner child knocks faintly at first, then louder, demanding to be heard. Will you keep the door closed, or will you risk opening it? She stood one evening before a mirror, fingers trembling, staring into her own tired eyes. For a brief moment she imagined the girl she had once been, laughing freely, twirling in a dress too big, hair wild in the wind. That girl was still there, waiting. And suddenly the silence felt unbearable, like a coffin too tight to breathe in. Something inside whispered, almost defiantly, "Speak." The word vibrated through her chest, fragile yet undeniable. Do you hear it too? That small voice within you that refuses to be buried any longer. The silence is beginning to crack, but cracks are dangerous. They let light in, yes, but they also let memory flood out. And when memory rises, shame follows like a tide, threatening to drown. Are you ready to face what comes rushing through once the seal is broken? Memory does not arrive politely. It crashes through the body like an uninvited storm. Her chest tightened, her throat burned, and her hands shook as if some hidden part of her knew that speaking would shatter the old order. The first flash was small, the sound of a door slamming, the sharp sting of being told to stop crying. Yet it carried the weight of a lifetime, because in that instant she had learned that emotion meant rejection. Can you trace the moment in your own story where tears became a liability, where your truth was turned against you? The subconscious is cunning. It buries these lessons in the marrow, then repeats them in every relationship. The indifferent partner mirrors the abs. And father. The manipulative friend echoes the shaming mother. Over and over the stage is reset, the same drama playing until the script is finally rewritten. Jung would call this the compulsion of fate, the unconscious arranging events until awareness intervenes. Without awareness, silence is not choice, it is destiny, and destiny unexamined will keep you bound, no matter how far you run. Her nights grew restless. She would wake at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. These were not just nightmares, they were summons from the unconscious. The psyche has its own clock, and when wounds fester too long, they rise, demanding recognition. She tried to push them down with distraction, with work, with perfectionism. But the harder she pressed, the louder they screamed. Heavy, isn't it? That the pain you spend your life avoiding waits faithfully for your return. In the language of archetypes, she was dancing with the shadow of the betrayed woman. This figure carries shame like a crown of thorns, believing herself unworthy because someone once failed to honor her essence. But shadows contain their opposites. In every betrayed woman sleeps the seed of the sovereign, the one who knows her worth is not determined by another's blindness. To step into that sovereignty, however, the silence must first be broken. And breaking silence is never gentle. It is a tearing, a rupture, a birth. She began to feel it somatically. Her shoulders ached from years of collapsing inward. Her jaw clenched at night until her teeth throbbed. These were not random discomforts. They were her body's way of carrying the unsaid. The body does not lie. It speaks through tension, fatigue, illness. Jung insisted that what the soul refuses to express will emerge in the flesh. So when you think of your own headaches, your own back pain, your own exhaustion, are you sure it is only physical, or is it your silence etched into your bones? The breaking point came quietly. One afternoon, someone dismissed her, a small cutting remark, almost trivial. But this time, something in her rebelled. Her heart raced, her throat burned, and before she could stop herself, words spilled out. Not loud, not polished, but raw. Her voice cracked, tears welled, yet she did not swallow them back. And in that trembling eruption, shame began to tremble too. Because shame feeds on silence, and when the silence fractures, so does its grip. Do you know this moment? The first time you said no without apology or admitted, "That hurt me," even when your voice shook. It is both terrifying and liberating because suddenly the cage door opens and you glimpse the sky. Yet with freedom comes fear. If you speak, will they leave? If you reveal, will you be rejected? These are not idle questions. They are the threshold every silenced soul must cross. The night after she spoke, she felt both lighter and rawer, as if her skin had been peeled back. Memory flooded, the laughter that was mocked, the tears that were scorned, the love that was betrayed. Each memory carried its own weight of shame, whispering, "You were too much. You were not enough." It was overwhelming, almost unbearable. But this was the path. Jung taught that one does not become illuminated by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And here, in the raw confrontation with shame, her true work began. But the question lingered, pulsing like a drumbeat. If silence dissolves and shame rises, how do you survive the flood without drowning? She discovered that surviving meant surrendering, not to shame, but to the body that carried it. The flood could not be stopped, but it could be felt. Her breath became shallow, her pulse quickened, and every muscle screamed to run. Yet she stayed. She placed a trembling hand over her heart, grounding herself in sensation rather than fleeing into thought. This was not weakness. This was courage in its rawest form. Can you imagine yourself sitting with that burning shame, refusing to exile it yet again? The inner child appeared then not as a memory but as a presence. A small girl crouched in the corner of her mind, wide-eyed, waiting for permission to exist. For years she had been silenced, punished, or ignored, and so she hid. Now in this vulnerable moment, the woman finally turned toward her. Her voice cracked, but she whispered, "I see you. You are safe now." And the child wept, not with words, but with the release of decades of sorrow. Heavy, isn't it? The realization that the voice you silence is often your own younger self. But the inner child does not trust easily. She tested the woman's sincerity. Would she be dismissed again or smothered with quick fixes? No, this time was different. Instead of demanding perfection, the woman offered presence. She listened to the child's sobs without flinching, allowed the trembling without shame. This was shadow work in motion, not analysis from afar, but a reunion with what had been disowned. Jung. Let it individuation, the process of reclaiming the fractured pieces of the soul. Every tear was a fragment returning home. Yet the flood did not relent. With each memory surface came a temptation, numbness. It would be so much easier to dissociate, to scroll endlessly, to bury the pain in busyness. But numbness is a thief. It steals the very transformation the pain carries. Stoics taught that the obstacle is the way, not the wall, but the doorway. And so she leaned into the trembling even when her body shook violently. She realized the shame was not infinite. It moved like a wave. If she could ride it, it would crest and pass. Have you felt that wave before? The terror that seems unbearable until you allow it, and then it softens. The archetype shifted again. The betrayed woman began to dissolve, making space for another figure, the warrior of truth. She was not armored in cruelty, but in radical authenticity. Her weapon was not vengeance, but voice. Each time she spoke honestly, no matter how clumsy, she swung that sword, cutting through generations of silence. And with every strike, shame recoiled, weaker than it appeared. This is the paradox. Shame masquerades as immovable stone, yet collapses when touched by light. Still, the work was exhausting. She found herself weeping without knowing why, memories erupting at inconvenient times, dreams vivid with symbols. One night, she dreamt of standing at the edge of a vast ocean. The water was dark, filled with shadows, yet in her hand was a lantern. She could step back into the dry land of silence, or she could walk forward into the surf, trusting the light. She woke with her heart pounding, the choice echoing inside her. Will you walk into the waters of your own unconscious, or will you retreat into exile? The next morning, her body gave the answer before her mind could. She placed her hand once more on her chest, breathed deeply, and allowed the tears to fall. No excuses, no apologies. In that moment, she understood the shame had always been afraid of exposure. It shriveled not in battle, but in being seen. And so she let herself be seen, first by herself, then by another. A friend, a journal, a whisper to the wind. Every expression was a fracture in the old silence, a thread unraveling the cage. But expression is only the beginning. Transformation demands embodiment. Words must become live truth, otherwise silence will return with new disguises. The question became louder now, reverberating through her. Will you keep speaking when the world resists, or will you retreat back into silence once the storm passes? The world did resist. Not everyone welcomed her voice. Some recoiled, some mocked, some withdrew. Each reaction tempted her to collapse back into old patterns, but something had shifted. She no longer sought validation from those who could not see her. Her worth, once dependent on others' approval, was slowly anchoring in a deeper ground. This is the essence of sovereignty, when the axis of your value moves from external gaze to inner knowing. Can you feel that tension in your own life? The pull to shrink for approval versus the urge to expand for truth. Embodiment became her next crucible. Speaking was a spark, but living it was fire. She began small, holding her shoulders higher, walking with slower steps, refusing to apologize for taking up space. Each action felt foreign at first, like wearing clothes too big. Yet over time, her body remembered what her soul already knew. She was not created to be invisible. Jung would remind us that identity is not discovered in theory, but forged through action. The psyche crystallizes around what is lived, not what is imagined. With each act of embodiment, new memories surfaced. She recalled the laughter she once stifled, the songs she never sang, the ideas she left unspoken. These fragments were not regrets, they were invitations. To reclaim them was to breathe life back into her soul. She danced alone in her room, messy and unpolished, tears streaming. She allowed her voice to crack as she hummed songs from childhood. She wrote letters she would never send, pouring out words that had been imprisoned for years. Every act was rebellion against shame's tyranny. Heavy, isn't it, to realize how much of your life has been lived in exile from yourself? But shame is cunning, it does not vanish easily. It whispered through her thoughts, tempting her with old doubts. You are too much. You will be abandoned. You will regret this. Each whisper was a test, a ghost of past betrayals. Instead of silencing them, she learned to respond. I hear you, she would say inwardly, but I no longer serve you. This was the alchemy of shadow work, turning poison into medicine by refusing to deny its existence. Do you answer your own inner voices, or do you still confuse them with truth? Archetypes shifted again. The inner child, once trembling, began to smile shyly, then to dance. The warrior of truth stood taller, steadier. And in the distance, another figure emerged, the healer. This archetype does not erase scars. She transforms them into symbols of resilience. She does not deny pain. She weaves it into wisdom. The woman felt this presence stirring within her, guiding her toward a life no longer defined by silence, but by expression. One evening, she returned to the mirror where her journey had begun. But this time, her gaze did not flinch. She saw the lines of weariness, the tears that had carved valleys into her cheeks, and she did not despise them. Instead, she saw proof that she had survived, proof that she had spoken, proof that shame no longer owned her. She whispered aloud, softly but firmly, I am here. And for the first time, the echo that answered back was not silence but presence. Yet the journey was not complete. Transformation is not a single act but a continual practice. The old silence would return in moments of stress. The old shame would whisper in moments of vulnerability. But now she carried tools, breath, embodiment, truth, compassion. Each time the wave rose, she could meet it without drowning. The cycle had shifted from exile to integration. Still, a deeper question awaited her, one that pressed like a final threshold. If her silence was broken, what would she dare to create with her reclaimed voice? Creation is the final rebellion against shame. To speak is to survive, but to create is to thrive. She began to write, not for applause but for release. Words tumbled onto the page like long-caged birds, raw and unpolished, yet undeniably alive. She painted in colors she once feared were too loud, let her hand smear across canvas as if reclaiming the right to take up space. Even in the kitchen, stirring soup or slicing fruit, she began to move with the intention of presence, as if every gesture was an affirmation. I exist, and my existence is worthy. Do you allow yourself to create without apology, or do you censor your expression before it even begins? Her creations were not flawless. Sometimes her voice cracked, sometimes her art was messy, sometimes her ideas faltered. But she realized perfection was never the point. Perfection had been another mask of silence, another prison. What mattered was honesty, the willingness to show up as she was without polishing herself into invisibility. Jung taught that the soul does not crave perfection but wholeness. Wholeness means mess, scars, contradictions. Wholeness means daring to be seen in your unfinished truth. Heavy, isn't it? The recognition that your flaws are not flaws at all, but doorways to connection. And with creation came connection. The more she spoke, the more she realized others were starving for the same freedom. Women who had silenced themselves for decades began to whisper, "Me too." Friends who always thought she was strong finally admitted their own cracks. Her voice did not isolate her. It magnetized others who longed to break their own cages. This is the paradox of vulnerability. What feels like exposure often becomes a bridge. Do you notice how others lean in when you speak the truths they are too afraid to name? Still, shadows lingered. The old fear of abandonment hissed at her heels. Each time she spoke with rawness, she braced for rejection. And sometimes rejection came. Some relationships could not withstand her truth. Some people preferred the muted version of her. These losses cut deep, but they were also clarifying. She began to see that what leaves when you speak your truth was never love. It was dependence, control, illusion. What remains is what is real. Can you accept the grief of losing false bonds in order to make space for authentic ones? The archetypal healer grew stronger within her, not because she never felt shame again, but because she learned to walk with it. Shame became a signal, not a sentence, a reminder to turn inward to check whether she was betraying herself. Each time she honored that signal, her inner child felt safer, her warrior steadier, her sovereign more rooted. The parts of her no longer pulled in opposite directions. They began to braid into wholeness. This was individuation in its living form, the psyche becoming a sanctuary, not a battlefield. One night she dreamed again of the ocean. This time she stepped into the water without hesitation. The waves rose around her, cold and dark, but her lantern burned brighter than before. She waded deeper, and instead of drowning, she began to float. The ocean no longer felt like a threat, but like an embrace. She woke with salt on her lips and tears in her eyes, realizing the dream was no longer warning but blessing. The unconscious was no longer enemy but ally. She stood by her window at dawn, watching the sky bleed into soft pinks and gold. For the first time in years, the silence around her did not feel suffocating. It felt sacred, like a canvas waiting for her voice. And she knew, with a clarity that shook her bones, silence would never again be her prison. It would be her sanctuary, a space she chose, not a cage imposed. The red thread that had once bound her in shame now wove itself into a crown. And so the open loop closed. The silence that had once dissolved her worth had become the soil where her voice grew roots. Shame, once a tyrant, now dissolved each time she chose truth. The little girl within her was no longer hidden. She danced in the sunlight, hand in hand with the woman she had become. And the question that began her journey finally found its answer. She no longer mistook absence for safety. Safety was here in her body, in her breath, in her voice. Now the mirror moment turns to you. Do you feel the crack in your silence, the whisper inside begging to be heard? Will you keep it buried, feeding the shame that thrives on secrecy, or will you dare to speak even if your voice shakes? Because the sanctuary is not out there. It is within you, waiting for your return.